Hicks.
Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Allyson Carter. I'm the Senior Acquisitions Editor at the University of Arizona Press. Welcome to our event, From Netzahualcóyotl to Aztlán, a conversation with Carlos G. Vélez-Ibáñez. Joining our conversation tonight is celebrated anthropologist and author Carlos G. Vélez-Ibáñez and fellow Transborder anthropologists and scholars Roberto Alvarez from University of California, San Diego, Pat Zavella from University of California, Santa Cruz, Josiah Heyman from University of Texas, El Paso, and Luis Plascencia, University of Texas at Arlington. On behalf of the University of Arizona Press, I want to thank Carlos and our guests for generously sharing their time with us tonight. The University of Arizona Press is the premier publisher of academic, regional, and literary works in the state of Arizona. We disseminate ideas and knowledge of lasting value that enrich understanding, inspire curiosity, and enlighten readers. We advance the University of Arizona's mission by connecting scholarship and creative expression to readers worldwide. Founded in 1959, the Press is a nonprofit publisher of scholarly and regional books. We publish about 55 books a year and have more than 1,600 books in print. These include scholarly titles in anthropology, archaeology, environmental studies, indigenous studies, history, Latinx studies, Latin American studies, and space sciences, as well as award-winning fiction and poetry series, Suntracks and Camino del Sol. Reflections of a Transborder Anthropologist, Velez-Ibáñez's new book shows how he and anthropology have changed and formed over a 50-year period. Throughout, he has worked to understand how people survive and thrive against all odds. Velez-Ibáñez has been guided by the burning desire to understand equity, inequality, exploitation, and legitimacy, and most importantly, to provide platforms for the voiceless to narrate their own histories. Carlos G. Vélez-Ibáñez is Regents Professor and the Motorola Presidential Professor of Neighborhood Revitalization in the School of Transborder Studies and Regents Professor in the School of Human Evolution and Social Change at ASU, at Arizona State University. His numerous honors include the 2020 France Boas Award for Exemplary Service to Anthropology, 2004 Robert B. Texter and Family Prize for Excellence in Anticipatory Anthropology, and the 2003 Bronislaw Malinowski Medal. Velez-Ibáñez was elected Fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science in 1994 and was named as a corresponding member of the Mexican Academy of Sciences, miembro correspondiente de la Academia Mexicana de Ciencias, in 2015, the only American anthropologist so selected. And with that, I will turn it over to Carlos. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Allyson. I very much appreciate the University of Arizona Press conducting and organizing this session. It's going to be an awful lot of fun because the interlocutors present, Roberto Alvarez, Pat Zavella, Luis Plascencia, and Josiah Heyman, in fact, are not only colleagues, but dear friends, as well as vicious critics. So I expect each of them, Roberto, now retired from the Department of Ethnic Studies at the University of California, San Diego, whose own work has been heavily influential in the formation of my own ideas. And of course, Pat Zavella, who is one of the stars at the University of California, Santa Cruz, also now retired, whose last work on reproductive justice is something that everyone needs to read. It is absolutely a marvelous work. And it's truly an extension of her very early feminist work among cannery workers back in the 80s. And Luis Plascencia, as I mentioned to my colleagues before, is a walking dictionary. and in Walking Encyclopedia. There isn't anything that Luis does not know about Mexico as well as the entire Southwest region. And he and Goya Cuadras have just published a wonderful book, The Making of Arizona, or is it Mexicans, The Making of Arizona? And it is a marvelous work. And as a matter of fact, I'm utilizing parts of it in my own work. And he also had a very heavy hand in the structuring of the final architecture of the book itself. And finally, Josiah Heyman, who is in fact also a dear friend, colleague, who in fact once initiated my doing some work with him because as he uttered in his usual calm manner, your work is now outdated. And so I very much appreciate Josiah's comment, which stimulated me, in fact, to go much further than what I had intended to do. And I've always thanked Josiah. And the first time, of course, I saw him, he had a modified Stetson hat coming in from the field, working in Cananea and along the border as well. And his own work, of course, has been fundamental in our understanding and structure of the border, as well as the distribution of inequality in all of its forms. And certainly the initiator of an awful lot of the thinking around those topics, in fact, was Roberto Alvarez. And Roberto Alvarez, although retired, continues to be an influential member of the Academy, having been the president of the Society for Applied Anthropology as well. So Roberto, if you don't mind, I'd like to start with you after just a very brief architectural description of the work itself. The book is divided into basically 3 phases and what I call an interlude. And it begins very early on with my early training at the University of California, San Diego, and it comes up to the present. The background behind me is, in fact, the congealed effort of 50 years of thinking in the School of Transborder Studies. So we're going to be taking up this work, Reflections of a Transborder Anthropologist, from Netzahualcóyotl to Aztlán with Roberto Alvarez.
I'm going to put on my reading glasses. I'd like to thank the University of Arizona as well, and especially Carlos and Pat and Joe and Luis for being here, and also for inviting me. It's an honor and just a very warm feeling to be with all of you. What I'm going to do is I'm going to read parts of the major parts of the foreword of the book that I put together for Carlos after he twisted my arm a little bit. So, Reflections of a Transborder Anthropologist is more than a memoir of one individual. It is a guide and record of an anthropological narrative that was initiated during the civil rights period. This book tells of one anthropologist's life work that is nestled in a history of a broader challenge to the social sciences. Not only is this anthropology of the highest order, Reflections illustrate the perspective and a passion that stem from a deep commitment and dedication to social justice. This is a long-term engagement in which Carlos Vélez-Ibáñez focuses on his own community, people of Mexican descent in Mexico and the United States. But the root of his passion is with those whom Eric Wolf called the people without history. Anthropologists have long elaborated and connected personally to community, challenging both the historical and anthropological narrative concerning the underclass. Yet this book also highlights the other social scientists who were once without voice, the native anthropologists like B. Medicine, Americo Paredes, Zora Neale Hurston, Emma Deloria, Octavio Romano, and others. Carlos is one of the few who not only turned to his own community, but tackled stereotypic misunderstandings, life struggles, and the scientific ruse of objectivity. The half century, 1970 to 2020, illuminated here was a period of native renaissance that moved with anthropology when the structures of the discipline elided the social justice of our times. Rather than succumb to the structural institutional mores of anthropology during the 60s and 70s, native anthropologists utilized personal experiences and community allegiances, as well as anthropological expertise to address class, race, ethnicity, poverty, and injustice, while celebrating the rich foundations from which we all came. This book is a testament to that period. Carlos, with many of our colleagues, challenged the distorted and ignored record of Mexicanos, Latinos, and natives, while contributing to and building an anthropology of our times. This book exemplifies this struggle. The research delineated in Reflections itself unveils a lifelong endeavor that began during the Chicano movement and the civil rights era. From his time as the first director of the Chicano Studies at San Diego State University in 1970, and the subsequent focus on Mexican rotating savings and credit associations, Roscas, we see Carlos's foundational development as activist scholar. This was an anthro-nativo endeavor confronting societal injustices among Latinos and Latinas in our hemisphere. Among the many examples is Carlos's applied research and engagement as expert witness to the sterilization of Latinas in Los Angeles. Carlos exposes the raw injustice and traumatic outcomes faced by people who are seen as powerless. Even today, Carlos laments this injustice, but like all his work, it is part of the structure and meaning of all his efforts. A sentiment and drive that pushed and garnered many of us. As documented here in the book, he continued his Rosca foci in different sites, illustrating not only the creative strategies of Mexican communities, but also the fine-tuning of anthropological method and theoretical application. The Rosca diffusion illustrates a cultural continuity across borders and importantly, demonstrates a transnational and transborder process that prevails in the North American hemisphere. This is a binding thread woven to all of Carlos's foci on the US-Mexican borderlands. This book illustrates adherence to human values and scholarly pursuit. Reflections is exemplary of social cultural mutuality shared by activists and ethnic scholars. This mutuality conjoined efforts to escape the structures of the discipline, to celebrate the profound depths of the communities, the people and regions from which we all came, while challenging the disciplinary boundaries and intellectual profiles of anthropology. The simultaneous scholar-activist current became an ethos we shared as anthropologists, but also as individuals bound by the endeavor of setting the record straight. This binding ethos was evident, especially in American Anthropological Association meetings, where in addition to the research presentations we delivered, our social gatherings rocked by Latino rhythms and joy. There is no anthropological vogue here, but a solid competency that incorporates a vast web of anthropological knowledge and the many anthropologists who contributed to this endeavor. As a period history of anthropology, Reflections illustrates the evolution of a research agenda and theory that incorporates a critical anthropology, but also an empathy for human life. Crucially, Carlos does not leave the people for whom he studied, lived with, and represented behind. They live and speak in this tome and in all of his work. What is evident is that he, as author, identifies with and is part of the communities, both anthropological and native, he has studied. His sound roots in the anthropological and broad belonging to the people without history steer his undying conviction for social justice. Reflections takes you through a variety of phases, highlighting specific research projects that range from Carlos's initial work in Mexico with Roscas to his most recent ventures on language hegemony in the Southwest. We find ourselves in and out of Mexico, along the borderlands, in the colonias, the academy, and in the minds and often the hearts of the people with whom he worked. The undercurrent throughout is the evolution of a transborder process that illuminates the human dimensions, the kin ties, and the wide webs of social, economic, and political interaction, which began with emphasis on the US-Mexican border. Rather than follow the template of border studies, Carlos defined the region as the Southwest North America. Yet there is another coinciding stream and current that, along with research, is evident here. Reflections tells of Carlos's institutional legacy that has touched scores of students, faculty community, and the social sciences in direct as well as in inadvertent ways. Beginning as the founding chair of the Mexican Studies Department at San Diego State, through the development of the Bureau of Applied Research and Anthropology at the University of Arizona, the Ernesto Galarza Center at the University of California, Riverside, to the most recent School of Transborder Studies at Arizona State University, we see an architecture in which social justice, human rights, and the diffusion of knowledge are foundational. As illustrated in this book, it is people, individuals, communities that ultimately benefit from this work. Here, Carlos's perception and engagement goes beyond his ethnographic connections and includes everyone with whom he has worked. During the Chicano movement, he supported community activists in the founding of Chicano Park in San Diego, California. A most current project is a college assistance for migrants program at the School of Transborder Studies. He has always been at the side of students and colleagues. This is the undercurrent that reflects a deep caring and corazon and heart that drives the work presented here. It is a passion and intellect that stems from the mind and heart. I, like many others, have personally been affected, supported, and challenged to the task by my colleague and brother, Carlos Vélez-Ibáñez. His exemplary efforts, represented in reflections, conjoin a compassion and competency that speaks from the heart and exemplifies the highest consciousness. Thank you. And
Wow.
Thank you, Carlos.
Thank you.
Well, first of all, I also want to express my appreciation for being invited to participate. These are great colleagues, people I miss seeing, not having been able to go to conferences. And I think this is a really important conversation to have. So I also want to begin by thanking Roberto for that beautiful preface or foreword. It really sort of captures what the book is about. And it really, I think, informs those who haven't had the opportunity to read it, sort of how the book is structured and how there are several themes woven throughout the book. So Carlos, I have a couple of questions that I want to pose to you. One is, when I came to the book, for some reason I saw reflections, so I thought it was going to be sort of a personal memoir. And that certainly is a through line. And some of us who have seen you speak at conferences have heard stories about your personal life, and they're very compelling. But in addition to doing that, as Roberto mentioned, you also sort of situate yourself in the changing nature of academia, both anthropology, but also the movement towards interdisciplinary studies and the development of the School for Transborder Research. And part of me was thinking, like, how does he even remember some of the stuff we all had to read back in the day, and how disciplined you were in citing all of that work that for many of us felt just didn't get it right. They didn't understand what was going on in our communities. And then I think the third narrative is sort of a deep history going back to the conquest and the different kinds of relationships between Mexicanos and Anglos and Native Americans, and really sort of situating your own work in relation to how the border region, or the North American, the Southwest North American region, as you call it, how it is completely integrated, and how movements of people very much took place in response to one another. And so to focus in on one particular group as somehow having its own internal history without paying attention to others is really not the right way to look at this. So I came away from this book really impressed. And my first question is, can you talk just a little bit about what made you decide to have this kind of approach as opposed to the personal narrative, or as opposed to some people when they produce a text after they retire, they sort of, or close to retirement, they pull together all their articles and they, write an introduction and that's it. But you have really done something much more elaborate and detailed. So I'd just like to hear a little bit about your thinking about this approach.
It's embarrassing to talk about myself to begin with. I like to talk, as you well know, about ideas and about events and our communities and struggles and all that, but I don't think my personal story is all that important, except in relationship to if it elaborates an idea or further enhances our capacity to tell something closer to that which we know to be true. And so I began thinking about this really from the Chicano movement as the springboard, but soon finding out that I just didn't know enough. And that's why I went back to school, as a matter of fact, University of California, San Diego. And so I've been thinking about all this process that led me to this point, and the why of that. And of course, there are other books that have accomplished some of this and others much better than mine. And that includes Eric Wolf's wonderful book, as well as Michael Carney's book as well in this vein. But they had a different narrative. So what I tried to do is to make the narrative a seamless one between myself and the narrative itself, so that I don't want to appear in front of, but rather want to appear to be part of it. And I think that comes from a sense that we are so privileged to do what we do, that we should not forget how many are not privileged. And so therefore, the position that I took has to do with not trying to accentuate self so much or ego so much, but rather to permit ego to tell the broader narrative of which I was a part and continue to be a part. I think that's the best I can do.
Great. I think for me, at least, and I think for many people, this is really a model for how to think about one's life's work. It's very, very helpful. And it's a good reminder of how things have changed dramatically. I'm at the point where, having written a book on social activism that basically no one knew the history, no one, it's not celebrated publicly. I really want us to pay attention to our forebears and all of the different struggles that happened before we got here and how we're building on that work. So I think the approach that you took is actually really helpful in that regard. So my second question has to do with the early work that you did on the sterilization abuse lawsuit that inexplicably the judge ruled against the women. And the film No Mas Bebés really captures so beautifully the trauma and the anguish that these women went through. But your discussion of it in this book really illustrates the methodology that you used in trying to make an argument that would support their claim. And so that was really helpful. But it also, with the benefit of hindsight and 30 years later, legal thinking, we now think of these kinds of egregious abuses, institutional abuses, as human rights violations. We're now talking about separating parents from children as a human rights violation. And we're thinking about the ways in which there's discriminatory effects as opposed to cultural kinds of arguments. And this comes also from my own experience, in which I testified in a case in which I was asked to make a cultural argument. And I basically did something very similar to what your project was, paying attention to notions of confianza and the way in which there are expectations, and that if your relatives ask you to do something like give them a ride, of course you do that, even if you don't know that they're going to rob someplace, well, you really didn't know that you can't expect them to share everything. So it was a cultural argument that basically didn't get very far either. And so it really makes me think about all of the anthropologists out there who are called on to give expert witness, often following a cultural logic that sometimes we don't feel fully comfortable with. And so what advice would you give to anthropologists who are called to testify and sort of bring our expertise as cultural anthropologists in a context in which there are different ways to argue lawsuits? And sometimes the lawyer takes an approach that may or may not make it.
The best model that I know of is Diego Vigil, who should also be here. If there's one individual who has been successful in utilizing his anthropological knowledge in order to counter effect the state penchant for imprisoning anyone who looks halfway like a cholo or not, or maybe has a tattoo that is not agreeable to a police officer, or the wholesale characterization of a group as gangs in order to arrest them wholesale, not unlike the 1940s approach by then Chief Ayers in the Los Angeles Police Department, in which Mexicanos, young men, were rounded up because of the way they looked. And Diego has been very successful in utilizing his intimate knowledge of the structure of gangs to counteract the very argument against gangs. So in a way, I think that one of the things that we need to, the lesson that at least I've learned, is not to couch our arguments in cultural terms. And the reason I say that, because there is another case that I served on much later on, years later, because very frankly, Patricia, as you well know, I promised myself never to again be a so-called expert witness in any trial, because of the use and misuse of my own work in the trial itself. And of course, in hindsight, I also fully understand the travails of taking a cultural argument, because it's too easily reducible to a stereotype, which is exactly what the judge did in the sterilization case, and used it against the women by basically saying that the doctors could not have known the effect of sterilizations because it took me 6 months to figure out the so-called quote unquote subcultural systems to which these women belonged. And so I think that we have to look for different kinds of strategies rather than the cultural argument. And the strategy that I took in the very last case that I was involved in was in fact the arrest of a woman for drug related charges, which would finally drop, but they finally wanted to judge her on a charge called misprison of a felony. That is that she knew that monies were being laundered, but she didn't report it. And that's how they arrested her. And of course, they took away just about every good that she had, everything from jewelry to houses to cars to you name it. And the lawyer knew the work that I had done among rotating credit associations, tandas. And the woman who had been arrested had told the lawyer about an awful lot of the money that she generated came from investing the sums of money she generated from rotating credit associations, from tandas. So she asked me to see if I could, in fact, do a kind of retroactive assembly of all of the sources of her income, especially through tandas and borrowing and a bunch of other ways. So I finally created this map of investments that emerged from the tandas without ever once talking about culture, but rather keeping it as an economic argument, which a court then understood, in the same way that Diego's argument had to do with urbanization, had to do with the structure of economy, had to do with police brutality and so on. In other words, our arguments, if we again use and try to reduce it to a cultural argument, that is too easily misused in what I've called in the article itself that I wrote up after that, a behavioral environment. And that is the courtroom is a behavioral environment which is also stratified and which represents power relationships as well. And I'll never forget, of course, that in the sterilization case, Antonia Hernandez was a relatively new graduate from UCLA's law school. And her partner had the same thing. And I was a brand new assistant professor at UCLA. So here you had three pichoncitos basically taking on the USC medical consortium. And the judge was a federal judge who was to the right of Genghis Khan. And so that behavioral environment was not conducive to a fair outcome. But we did it anyway because there was nobody else around. There truly wasn't anyone else around. And here I was, a brand new assistant professor, being asked to do this. Of course, being a cocky Chicano anthropologist, and among the first, and all the blah blah that we all believed in at that particular point in time. You know, I in fact agreed to become part of that case. So I think the argument, again, we have to try as much as possible to explain the structure of relationships rather than culture in a language that a public can understand. And that's the tricky part. You know, I think anyway.
So FYI, there's an effort to get reparations for these women. There's legislation that has now gone to committees. So the activists that are pushing this, I'm on the board for California Latinas for Reproductive Justice. They are very happy that the bill is moving along. They've tried it last year and it didn't get anywhere. So fingers crossed, we might actually see something positive come out of this. So I have other questions and comments, but I'm going to pass it on to one of my colleagues.
Yeah, I think I'll pick up the thread, and I want to thank Carlos above all for being the incredible presence that's brought us together here, and University of Arizona Press for convening this. And I want to give some praise to University of Arizona Press. I thought that Allyson was underselling by saying it's the artistic and scholarly focus of Arizona, I think really it is the great regional press of Southwest North America. And that's not to dismiss the other great university presses of the region, both countries, but University of Arizona Press, I think it's important that we think about things coming out of places. And this is really a great representation of that, great presentation of that. So I'm not going to be quite as elegant as Pat Zavella. I have one observation, which isn't quite made it to being a question, but Carlos may want to play off of it. And then I do have a question. So let me start with the observation, Carlos, which starts with your book title, An Impossible Living in a Transborder World. And interestingly, what I'm going to focus on is not transborder, even though I'm like the border obsessed person par excellence, but is on the impossible living part, which I think is simply a great phrase. And the entire book is filled with those kinds of insights. And that is something that comes out of thinking on two tracks at the same time. One of them is the massive inequalities and unfairnesses, much of which, but not all of which, is in the political economy, ideology, gender, race, all of these things, your double helixes. I think there's many helixes there, really. Spinning around people, and that's one side of the impossibility, but it's impossible living. People are succeeding at in some cases, but then getting crushed also, make a living in the midst of all of this. And they're doing it through a very creative, if I may be allowed to say, cultural way of deploying their livings. That concept may get so badly misused, but it's still, there's something out there. So the rotating savings and credit associations, the Roscas, the Tandas and Quinielas and so forth of the greater Mexico and of the entire world, really, are a incredibly vibrant, creative way of trying to survive in this impossible world. So it's an impossible living. Both of those words really seem to me to communicate something. So I wonder if you have some reflections on that theme in your work, and then I'll pick up with another question.
Yeah. I find it almost impossible to believe that so much of our population is able to live as generous human beings. That's the impossible part for me. That's the genesis of it. That is, it's an impossible trek to live. And of course, it starts for me in a very personal way with my own mother, who was the daughter of a military general who was killed at the Battle of Las Vacas, Coahuila in 1913 during the Revolution, who was a federal officer, not for the Revolution. While simultaneously, his wife, my grandmother, and by the way, they were 27 years apart in age, and that's why the difference. While she, in fact, in the courtyard of her home, would use sheets and pillowcases to plug up the wounded revolutionaries in her courtyard, while her husband was being killed in this Battle of Las Vacas. And when my mother related that to me, I said to myself, and I didn't use these words at the time that she uttered them, but I thought, how can she deal with that contradiction? So that very early on, I started learning about this contradiction of almost impossibly not being able to live, but living anyway and becoming generous human beings. And that in part is implied by the impossible living metaphor. And that's really where it begins. And all of the oral histories also shared in the household accentuate this theme of being of an impossible, almost an impossibility to live, but doing it anyway and doing it well. And that's been an underlying kind of interest for me in almost every work that I've ever done, from border visions to hegemonies of language, and out to this work that kind of tries to tie it all up. I mean, I can tell you oral stories after oral stories, narratives after narratives, all of us have here. I mean, Roberto's familia work, where does it come from if it wasn't coming from su familia? Pat's work coming from the lessons learned in her household. Luis as well. You as well, Josiah. All of us then have access to these rich narratives. Many times, however, nobody pays attention to them because we're X, Y, or Z, or you look because you look like that, or because you look different, or whatever other reasons that and ungenerous and inhuman kinds of categorizations that people then generate about others, because nobody pays attention to these narratives. And I think Eric Cook was right. You end up with, in fact, a population being told that they have no histories.
Right. I think it's not well understood that title of Woolf's was an ironic title. It was a critical title.
Yes.
Of the way people reduced to being without history. I would throw in there that I think a great quality in your work is that you think two very different thoughts at the same time. I mean, that doesn't sound like it's an incredible accomplishment, but it really is, because most scholars and most activists don't think two very different thoughts at the same time. In this case, thinking about the system and thinking about the creativity and the humanity. And all shot through all of your work is that thinking those two different things at the same time. The other thing I wanted to ask you to reflect a little bit on is the applied. Your persistent drive to create applied projects and applied centers, and to value that. And to call it applied, now, and I use this sometimes myself, trying to be less pedestrian by calling it engaged or activist or whatever. I don't think, however, we should actually be putting down the applied tradition in anthropology. We know it's got huge flaws, but maybe you can reflect a little bit on your persistence with that across your career.
Chicano movement. The best answer that I can give you is Chicano movement. Being engaged in the late 60s and early 70s in the Chicano movement, I heard this one time in a meeting of faculty and staff and students at San Diego State, in which there was a great deal of argumentation going on about the direction of the department, where the department should go, the kind of ideological frameworks that people should be utilizing. And you had, on one side, you had the Trotskyites, you had the Maoists, you had the nationalists, and so on and so on. And you had all of these aspects of the movement involved, from Católicos por la Raza, I mean, you name it. You had the farm workers. I mean, you had all this kind of regional representations and localities also. And I remember, I think if I'm not mistaken, I think it was Rene Nunez, who has now passed, unfortunately. He said, no matter what we write and what we pretend to know, that if we don't put what we know to work on behalf of the people that we're working with, then it should just, it's only going to remain on the bookshelf and it's not going to mean anything to anybody. Now, this was 50 some years ago, before I ever got into anthropology, but that always stuck with me. So my first entree into the applied work was, in fact, the unconsenting sterilizations of Mexican women. That was my very first try in trying to generate useful information for the benefit of the population itself. And of course, I learned a really hard lesson in fact, finding out that what I thought I knew, I didn't know as well. And that made me really modest about what I thought I knew. And that I could never stop learning. That's the other part of it. So everywhere that I've gone, that one comment by Renee, 50 some years ago, always resonated with me. So it didn't matter where I went, whether I was a dean or whether I was a director or whatever it was. The stuff that I was involved in, at least for me anyway, the stuff that I was involved had to have some kind of benefit for the population that really needed it. And our populations really needed it. And that's why I've always tried to utilize resources and generate resources for the benefit, and especially of youngsters, to give them a springboard for them to be able to make a decision about what they wanted to do. Because for me, it isn't a springboard to success. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is the opportunity to be able to make a choice about whether you wanted to be successful or not, or whether you wanted to go in one direction or another, which too much of our population just doesn't have that opportunity and continues not to have that opportunity.
I think we should move on to Luis and let Luis is the last and best of the interlocutors.
First of all, I also want to thank Carlos for the invitation to participate and the University of Arizona Press. And I also agree significantly with Josiah that it is one of the great regional presses, that it's one of the understated assets in Arizona. I divided my comments into some observations and in a question, but I think Pat's and Josiah's question in a sense covered that. So I won't focus on the question. The question I do with in a sense, also the applied part of the issue. But so I'll just limit my comments to the observations. In reflections, the first thing to note is how apt the title is to the work, especially the first part, reflections. It is a document of reflections. In it, the author presents a frank discussion that foregrounds an intellectual and research practices in an honest way about the difficulties and challenges in conducting anthropological fieldwork. That in contrast, that oftentimes when we read introductory textbooks to anthropology, it's all made very clean and simple. That simply, these are the things that if you know about anthropology, you can just go out and do it. But I think in reflections presents a different image, a different representation of that. In the work, he also underscores the importance of interrogating our conceptual assumptions, that when we enter a particular issue, a particular community, we do have a baggage of assumptions, conceptual assumptions, perhaps theoretical assumptions that we bring into those. And so Carlos underscores that the importance of interrogating those assumptions. The other point that is stressed in multiple places in the book is that the importance of maintaining a sense of responsibility to the communities that grant us entry, so that rather than take for granted that somehow, because we're anthropologists, that we need to be welcomed by those communities, but the fact that we have a sense of responsibility to those communities, that they did allow us entry into those. And communities can be a smaller group or it can be sort of a geographic community. But the fact that those communities granted us entry into their lives is something that can oftentimes get lost. The other observation that it's important to note that it is not a romantic text about our great achievements and superior intellectual capacities as social anthropologists, nor of the always positive impacts we have on communities that we intervene in. Despite our best intentions, unexpected things can and do happen. Another way to say this in kind of a popular terminology framework is, it is not a 12-step plan for conducting great anthropological research for an audience of undergraduate or graduate students. It is not. It's not a recipe or a menu to say, okay, if you follow the steps in chapter 1 and through chapter 9, that you can do great anthropological work. If anything, it basically raises the opposite concern. Is be careful. Be conscious of how you understand what you are looking at. So that's one. So in kind of related sense, it's a corrective to potential illusions that we may harbor. We can view the text as a description of the economic and political reality that we are embedded in because of the institutions that trained us and that we depend on for our own survival and mobility, and how our understanding of individuals and households struggling to survive and maintain their humanity within the same broad context. We cohabit a particular social arrangement. They are part of that, and we are part of it. And I think Carlos's discussion, multiple points, underscores that we also, as the anthropologists, also inhabit that same world. And so it's not an easy place to be. So some of the other elements that stand out that perhaps may not be noticed by a lot of the readers is that part of the scholarship can be read as an earlier effort to decolonize anthropology and anthropological practices and to contest the coloniality within the field, but not explicitly invoked with those labels. So if one reads many of the sections, one sees the process, but Carlos may not explicitly say, well, in the following argument, I'm presenting a decolonial or an argument against coloniality in research. He doesn't say it, but in essence, if you look closely at some of the things that he does, you can see that he's struggling to create a different practice that takes into account the context that we operate in. The scholarship can also be placed within a scholarly critique of contemporary capitalism and its multiple neoliberal forms, but he's also makes it clear, given Heyman's key framing of non-dogmatic Marxism. So he takes it seriously that yes, we need to understand the functioning and how contemporary capitalism operates, but we also need to be careful not to assume a dogmatic understanding of structure. Yes, we can point to structural conditions, but we cannot simply stop there at indexing that there are structural conditions that make impossible living. There are other things, there are other dimensions that are part of that. So I think that's an essence, well, it's an important issue that is there in the text. Let me just go on. Also, the text provides a number of, if you read it closely, it provides a number of examples for younger scholars in terms of research questions. He doesn't frame it, Carlos doesn't frame it as, well, this is a topic for future research. But if graduate students or undergraduate students read some of the text closely, they can actually observe some of those things. For example, Senor Garcia on page 29 and the very short text on page 30. Why is Senor Garcia relevant? Well, he's relevant because Carlos learned something from Senor Garcia, and that is that Senor Garcia had participated in the World War II contract labor arrangements. He also participated in UFW organizing efforts in California, and he later transferred those organizing skills to Netza. Right? And so what Carlos briefly states there is the importance of transnational labor, not simply in one direction of south to north, but that transnational labor issues can also move north to south. And obviously, we know the link between the Clifton-Morenci copper mine strike in Arizona and the links to Cananea strikes in Sonora, right? So there was another example where transnational labor issues that emerged on the northern part of the Southwest North American region also impact and can be carried across to the southern part of the region. So there are a number of kind of tidbits sprinkled throughout the text that a graduate student could look at and say, oh, I didn't know that happened. I wonder what else exists that draws our attention to this particular issue. Anyway, and it's now kind of reaching the end of the session, so I will stop there. Yeah.
By the way, sometimes those tidbits are conscious.
Oh, I assume so.
But you're right. I hate the obvious. I hate the obvious. I don't like to hit people over the head with stuff. So I do lay little tidbits and sprinkle them.
Yeah.
And if you read it, and my assumption is, if you really read it, you'll get it. If you just brush it off, I do. And so yeah, I do that sometimes on purpose.
Okay. So, anyway.
Gracias.
Por nada.
Everyone, I'm Savannah Hicks. I'm the marketing assistant at the University of Arizona Press, and I want to start our Q&A session with our panelists now. We have a few questions in the chat, so I'll just go ahead and ask the first one from Abby Mogollon. She says, a question for Dr. Velez-banez. You've been thoughtful about reflecting on your career and changed your thinking throughout your career. You said you were a continuous learner. Why is this important for scholars and for all of us to do?
Well, for one thing, it keeps you honest. It keeps you in this very privileged position of not permitting your ego to take over your common sense about yourself. It's too easy to do because there's so much attention paid to what you do, not what you are, but what you do. And so you've got to constantly maintain for me, the assumption that I don't know all that much. And it's true. When I compare myself to the four of you, and I marvel at what you four know. I marvel. I'm truly, this is not nonsense just because you're here. But when you multiply that out on a daily basis with all of the great people that you meet in this very privileged place called the university, and you multiply all that out and you say to yourself, wow, look at all that I do not know. So it's important then for us to maintain a sense of modesty about what we do. Because for one thing, there are an awful lot of people that can't do what we do. And some take for granted what we do, as it somehow we have some kind of a license for it. Where all of us come from basically from working class background, and there was no license for our parents. how many times did my dad come home from work? He was a mechanic, really a smart guy, and a great mechanic. And one day he came home and he was very sad. And before that one day, he always used to tell us about his work, how he, in fact, he had the capacity to listen to a gearbox in a semi truck and note what gear was used up, and could take the thing apart and then repair it. I mean, he had that kind of craftsmanship, and he was very proud of it. And so he would come home and he would tell us, we didn't understand half of the nomenclature that he was using, but it didn't matter. But one day he came home really saddened, and my mother asked him, "Y viejo, ¿qué tienes?" And so he told my mother that he had asked the foreman for a raise. And the foreman said to him that if he didn't like it, he should go back to Mexico. Now, here was a man, and I'm not touting place so much, but here was a man whose great uncle saw the last Mexican flag come down in Tucson. And this is a familia that truly is a transborder familia. You know, the Ure Sonora to Tucson. Right? And so here you have this foreman telling my dad to go to back to Mexico. And so he never talked about his work again. And I will never forget that. And in one way or another, each of us here have seen our parents go through something equivalent, if not the same. So that's the best way I can answer
it. Cindy Sturts sort of sent in a follow-up to that question asking, how do we mentor this / model this for our students, and how do we teach it?
I don't have a panacea. I can only be an example. The example is be modest about what you know. Share what you know without immodesty. And share it because you want that person to grow and to achieve and to have the option to achieve what that person wants to achieve. That's the underlying kind of formulaic, regardless of who it is.
Karen Davalos is asking, Carlos, can you say more about the ways you're remaking anthropology? Or can we say we have remade anthropology as Chicanas and Chicanos who work in collaboration with transborder communities?
I'll leave that. Let me ask my colleagues to answer that. I have a particular point of view, but I'd rather not be just the only voice. Roberto, you've been around these parts as long as I have. ¿Qué crees?
What was the question again?
He nods off, by the way, you guys.
Yeah, you nod off. Yeah. Get my vodka down here.
I can repeat it. Can you say more about the ways you are remaking anthropology? Or can we say we have remade anthropology as Chicanas and Chicanos who work in collaboration with transborder communities?
Well, I think that in some ways, anthropology has been remade, not solely by Chicanos and Chicanas and Latinos and so on. But I think that just looking at this panel here, the folks that are here, and thinking about the work that they've done and we've done together, actually the community has made a huge difference in anthropology, for one thing. As we all know, we're trained as individuals to look at, our people and our research, etc. But here we have a semblance of true community in the academy, true community in sharing our thoughts and ideas and feelings. Something that's often left out of the anthropological. Yeah, we feel for the folks that we work with, but when we're back in the academy, there's a different sense of who we are. And I think that this book in particular illustrates that growing sense of a community, of the relationships and that mutuality that we all share as anthropologists, especially from the work that we've done on the border and with the populations that we work with. But it's hard for me to keep up these days with what anthropology really is. I think that there are so many aspects of it now that I don't think we ever really envisioned. But the heart of what we've done, I think, is really what Carlos is all about, and what this book is all about. So, and I think each of us brings something that's different and new. One of the things I always try to emphasize with my students, that every one of them has a unique view, a unique contribution to make. And it's not us old folks, these old guys and women and so on that are illustrating how to do anthropology. It's the new and the new vigor that's coming out of the young people that are engaged now.
No, when I see, the work, like, for example, of a young woman from, and I forgot her first name, I'm sorry, but Dr. Midas, who's a young anthropologist who works in Vermont. And anybody remember her first name by any chance? Joe, do you remember Midas's first name?
Is it Teresa?
I think so. Anyway, she did this marvelous work on the other border, the Canadian East Coast border, with a focus on undocumented workers and all of the issues having to do with food security and food autonomy. And that's a whole area, by the way, that we didn't touch. Not really. And this is but underlying this is this penchant for caring about the population with whom they're working. And I think that's a little different than the old anthropology that we went into. That is, that we take responsibility for working with the population with whom we're associated. And these are not our informants. These are the people who permit us to be among their presence. And that's a very different gestalt, a very different way of looking at stuff. We are there by permission, y esa es su casa, no mi casa. And that's a very different kind of relationship that's established with the people with whom we work. And I think that's a real difference that we helped, because there are other anthropologists who feel the same way, who are not Mexican or not Chicano, but have that same attitude. What do you think, Matt?
I totally agree. And this is reminding me of the conversations I've had with my colleagues. We had a School of Advanced Research seminar with Gina Perez and Alex Chavez, convening a group of 10 of us. And what we're calling our book is Ethnographic Refusal, Latinidades, Disruptive Latinidades. So we're trying to both problematize the notion of Latinidad, but also traditional ethnographic research. And so I think we are very much part of a group of a cohort huge numbers of critical anthropologists who refuse that model of colonialism and the individual, often male ethnographer who goes and understands the folk. And in fact, we're negotiating relationships in which we are integrated into communities on their terms. And we're also not only trying to be advocates for the communities, but trying to change what anthropology is about. And I think the anthropology of today is incredibly different than what it was when you and I and all of us first joined the discipline. It's different in so many ways. And so I think we're moving toward a more interdisciplinary decolonial anthropology, although there's plenty of work to be done.
I might say something. I was just thinking about how other people see the anthropologist. And, I went from a very traditional department of anthropology to an ethnic studies department where the anthropologist is the devil, and I was always introduced as a recovering anthropologist, which is true, and what was so amazing to me about it is that I was so in tune with what I thought anthropology was. And even the methodology, the basic textbooks, things that I use, and I tried to transfer into an ethnic studies curriculum. But most of the students wouldn't buy it. And it was an incredible experience for me because the critiques that were coming out of the classroom were critiques that were based on community experience, on the colonized experience, on the non-white experience. And it was very troubling at first because often I didn't have the right answer. I'd come back and say, good Lord, man, what's going on? But it was a re-education for me. And I think a lot of it also is the what you just said, Pat, the integration of the disciplines now, because even though the anthropologist was the devil, most of the texts that we used in ethnic studies were anthropology texts. I would say 60-70% of the texts that were used at the time. But it's just a comment, because sometimes we get caught up in our own, in the discipline, and in our own careers and so on about what anthropology is. And if we take a sidestep once in a while, it's very, very different to a lot of people, especially in the academy.
But I would say that the challenge today is that, and this may actually be worsened by the difficult job situation and political economy of universities, that there is a very strong pull in the direction of highly esoteric ivory towerism. And so it combines with that move in the direction of critical, there's both critical thinking and at the same time, a kind of incredible embrace of very, very elitist intellectualism. So the real challenge is to, once again, like Carlos did, thinking on two tracks at the same time. How can we be thinking, really grounded in the lived experiences of people in communities that always surround universities and colleges? They're not, the universities and colleges are not actually on an ivory tower. They're surrounded by working class people, and Boulder or not. And how can we be really, really, thinking about the crucial experiences of their lives, and at the same time be doing very sophisticated, penetrating, critical, intellectual work of whatever kind. And, I think, Carlos, your work has really been a model for that. And I think we need to maintain those two things going on at the same time so that we don't get pulled off into this very, very pretentious academic elitism, even as academia falls apart around us.
Yeah, it's like a reaction formation, right? That's one. The other thing I was going to suggest, it's also very important, by the way, and I think we've had an awful lot to do with it, is the relationships with our Mexican counterparts. And that's been very important. I mean, some of the best work on Mexican communities, for example, here in Arizona, in the Phoenix area, is from the University of Sinaloa, they're bringing their students across the border before the pandemic, obviously, and doing all sorts of community evaluation of Sinaloenses in Phoenix. And they show up at the front door with a little white coat and with a badge, Universidad Autónoma de Sinaloa, and they're greeted as friends rather than as an anthropologist, because they represent themselves as university students, and Mexican families know that university students are welcome in their home. So the kind of material that, in fact, they are able to generate is very rich and of great wealth. And there's an awful lot of Chicano anthropologists, one, who don't read Spanish, two, even less, don't read any of the literature that our Mexican colleagues are creating about Mexicans in the northern side of the border. And that there's a wealth of works that are being done from Sonora, Sinaloa, and I would guess as well from Chihuahua, Joe.
Absolutely, and all along the border. I mean, the extent to which there is still a failure of dialogue between the United States and Latin America, and many other parts of the world, but notably Latin America and notably Mexico is really truly shocking and scandalous. So, North American anthropology, truthfully, and North American border studies is produced as if there isn't work being done in Mexico at the same time that should be read and cited. I mean, some of the work in Mexico is pedestrian, but plenty of the work in the United States is pedestrian too.
With wheels.
With wheels, yes. No, it is inexcusable that we don't intellectually speak to each other. I mean, sometimes we collaborate, especially when it's convenient to have a project. There's still this colonial dimension in the actual performance of academic work in Latin America. And some of our big institutions, I won't elaborate on this too much, but for example, National Science Foundation won't fund Mexican academics, Mexican collaborators. We have to go through all kinds of weird bureaucratic arrangements to get money to our collaborators. So, yeah.
Yeah.
I think we have time for probably one more question. Jim Gerber asks, when you talk to people unfamiliar with Southwest North America, how do you tell them about the integration of the border region across the national boundary? What are the things in your focus?
Well, you start looking at a map first. Okay, and then you see some real peculiarities. One peculiarity is this river that starts up in the Sierra Madre and flows out the Gulf of Mexico. There's another river that also starts at the Sierra Madre and flows out the Sea of Cortez. And then you have all the riverine systems that cross east and west as well as south to north. And then you have this huge cordillera of the Sierra Madre that goes right up the middle of Mexico and ends where the Rocky Mountains begin. And then, of course, you have those humongous deserts, the Sonoran Desert being one, and of course, the Chihuahuan Desert being the other. And they have no borders. And of course, getting to Joe and Luis's work, especially on transborder labor, and especially the importance of the copper mines, you have these huge copper avenues that extend all the way from Caborca all the way up to Bisbee. And it's the same basic copper veins that were in fact mined by American copper companies in Cananea, as well as in Clifton and Morenci. And the border that was being utilized was in fact the Mexican miners who were attracted by higher wages into Bisbee and Clifton and Morenci and so on. So how do we explain it? You begin with a map, and then you look at the ecology of the region, then you look at all of the changes over time, beginning from the pre-Hispanic period to the present. And that's really how you know that in fact the border that was created and imposed only occurred 2 grandmothers ago.
All right, everyone, we're gonna have to wrap up our session. I want to thank you, Carlos and Roberto and Patricia and Joe and Luis for sharing your time and scholarship with us tonight. Tonight's event could not have happened without the support of my colleagues at the University of Arizona Press and our University of Arizona Libraries family. We hope to see you at our next event, which will be on Wednesday, March 17th, with beloved poet Juan Noel, who will read from his new poetry collection, Transversal. Noel will be joined by Camino del Sol series editor Rigoberto Gonzalez in this online event. For more information, please visit our website, uapress.arizona.edu, where you can also purchase tonight's book. And we're having a great sale right now. It's 40% off with free shipping. So if you visit our website, there's more information about how to get the sale. And finally, thank you to all of you who joined us. The best part of publishing books like Reflections of a Transborder Anthropologist is the opportunity to share them. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight. It's been a really great session.
Thank you all
Thank you.
for this opportunity.
Carlos.
Comadres y compadres.
Thank you,
muchas
Carlos.
gracias por su
Thank you.
presencia.
Thank you for bringing us together, Carlos.
Yep. Thank you. And for the
Very
press.
welcome.
Gracias, Luis.